Welcome, Robert.
Well, thanks for inviting me on your podcast.
I'm absolutely delighted to have you. So I'm going to dive right in and begin by reading the mission statement to the Mars Society. I'm going to read it just straight from the book. In 1998, a meeting of 700 people was held in Boulder, Colorado, to found a movement called the Mars Society. I am its president. In the quarter century since its founding, it has grown to involve tens of thousands of people from all over the world. Here is our founding declaration. The time has come for humanity to journey to the planet Mars. We are ready. Though Mars is distant, we are far better prepared today to send humans to the Red Planet than we were to travel to the Moon at the commencement of the space age. Given the will, we could have our first cruise on Mars within a decade. The reasons for going to Mars are powerful. We must go for the knowledge of Mars. Our robotic probes have revealed that Mars was once a warm and wet planet, suitable for hosting life's origin. But did it? A search for fossils on the Martian surface or microbes in groundwater below could provide the answer. If found, they would show that the origin of life is not unique to the Earth, and by implication reveal a universe that is filled with life and probably intelligence as well. From the point of view of learning our true place in the universe, this would be the most important scientific enlightenment since Copernicus. We must go for the knowledge of Earth. As we begin the 21st century, we have evidence that we are changing the Earth's atmosphere and environment in significant ways. It has become a critical matter for us to understand all aspects of our environment. In this project, comparative planetology is a very powerful tool, a fact already shown by the role Venusian atmospheric studies played in our discovery of the potential threat of global warming by greenhouse gases. Mars, the planet most like Earth, will have even more to teach us about our home world. The knowledge we gain could be key to our survival. We must go for the challenge. Civilizations, like people, thrive on challenge and decay without it. The time is past for human societies to use war as a driving stress for technological progress. As the world moves towards unity, we must join together, not in mutual passivity, but in common enterprise, facing outward to embrace a greater and nobler challenge than that which we previously posed to each other. Pioneering Mars will provide such a challenge. Furthermore, a cooperative international exploration of Mars would serve as an example of how the same joint action could work on Earth in other ventures. We must go for the youth. The spirit of youth demands adventure. A Humans to Mars program would challenge young people everywhere to develop their minds to participate in the pioneering of a new world. If a Mars program were to inspire just a single extra % of today's youth to scientific educations, the net result would be tens of millions more scientists, engineers, inventors, medical researchers, and doctors. These people will make innovations that create new industries, find new medical cures, increase income, and benefit the world in innumerable ways to provide a return that will utterly dwarf the expenditures of the Mars program. We must go for the opportunity. The settling of the Martian New World is an opportunity for a noble experiment in which humanity has another chance to shed old baggage and begin the world anew, carrying forward as much of the best of our heritage as possible and leaving the worst behind. Such chances do not come often and are not to be disdained lightly. We must go for our humanity. Human beings are more than merely another kind of animal. We are life's messenger. Alone of the creatures of the earth, we have the ability to continue the work of creation by bringing life to Mars and Mars to life. In doing so, we shall make a profound statement as to the precious worth of the human race and every member of it. We must go for the future. Mars is not just a scientific curiosity. It is a world with a surface area equal to all the continents of Earth combined, possessing all the elements that are needed to support not only life, but technological society. It is a new world, filled with history waiting to be made by a new and youthful branch of human civilization that is waiting to be born. We must go to Mars to make that potential a reality. We must go, not for us, but for a people who are yet to be. We must do it for the Martians. Believing, therefore, that the exploration and settlement of Mars is one of the greatest human endeavours possible in our time, we have gathered to found this Mars Society, understanding that even the best ideas for human action are never inevitable, but must be planned, advocated and achieved by hard work. We call upon all other individuals and organisations of like-minded people to join with us in furthering this great enterprise. No nobler cause has ever been. We shall not rest until it succeeds. So I just wanted to make sure everybody heard that mission statement before we begin. I think let's begin with how we will travel to Mars, why it has why you believe it has become easier than ever before. Let's begin with Starlink and how that has contributed to the ease of getting there.
Okay, well, Starship. Starlink is a communication system.
Apologies.
Okay. The Starship is a fully reusable heavy-lift launch vehicle that is in the process of being developed by Elon Musk's SpaceX company. Okay, now, I should say I and the Mars Society more broadly were largely responsible for helping to recruit Musk to making Mars, humans to Mars, his or one of his callings in life. He read my earlier book, The Case for Mars, and he came to a fundraiser that we had in Silicon Valley, where we were raising money for our Mars Desert Research Station, which in fact was built. He made a substantial donation, and he joined our board for a while. But then at a certain point, he said to me that he was one of these people that doesn't want to be part of somebody else's operation. He has to lead his own, and he had already was quite rich from PayPal and was deciding what to do with the rest of his life. And he thought the two most significant things that there could be done in the remaining, in his lifetime, were either the making solar energy practical or humans to Mars. I argued for Mars because the business case for solar energy is obvious. If it can be made competitive against fossil fuels, it will prevail. If not, it will not. And anyone with a credible business plan can find investors to give it a try. Whereas Mars is, you have to have a lot more vision. In the end, he decided to do both and also launched the car company as well. But to come back to this thing, Musk realized that the opening of the space frontier required a drastic lowering of the cost to orbit, which could only be achieved by making launch vehicles reusable. Imagine, in round numbers, a Boeing 737 costs $100 million, and it seats something like 100 people. If you threw it away after each flight, an airplane ticket would have to cost an order of $1 million each, just to pay for the plane. Instead, people ride on airplanes for a couple of $100 a ticket, depending upon where they're going. That's because airplanes are reusable. Launch vehicles haven't been. So he first developed a very small launch vehicle to get in the business, but then he created the Falcon 9, which is a medium-lift launch vehicle that was mostly reusable. That is, the lower stage is reused. The upper stage, which is smaller, is not. But that did result in a cut of cost of launch by a factor of 5 compared to what had been the case for the past half century. Now they're moving on from there to create a fully reusable vehicle, which they call Starship. And it's a two-stage vehicle like the Falcon is, but much bigger. It'll have 5 times the payload, 100 tons to orbit, which is a bit less than the Saturn V moon rocket, but in the same class. The Saturn V could do 140. But the Saturn V was expendable. This is reusable. So it's going to cut launch costs by another factor of 5, at least, maybe more, if it's successful. And they're rapidly testing it. They've done, I lost track, but it's around 3 flight tests so far, of which each one got further into the flight envelope than the one before. The first one failed. It got into the air and all that, but it caused a lot of damage to the pad. It was kind of messy. The second one did a lot better. The third one did better still. They'll probably fly it a 4th time in a month or 2. And I believe that by the end of the year, this will be an operational system. And this thing runs on methane and oxygen as its fuel and oxidizer. A rocket needs both a fuel and an oxidizer to burn the fuel because it flies in space where there's no air. And this is the cheapest possible propellant combination, but more importantly, it is the easiest propellant combination to make on Mars. In my own book, The Case for Mars, and I outlined a plan called Mars Direct, which laid out a way to do Mars missions, doing direct flight to Mars and direct return from Mars using locally produced propellant, methane, oxygen produced from Martian water and carbon dioxide. That's the plan that Musk has embraced, but with a fully reusable vehicle. And these things are going to make all sorts of business plans that people have for commerce and Earth orbiting research labs, space hotels, all this kind of stuff that people have talked about for a long time, but which were not possible from a business point of view with high launch costs. But if you cut the launch cost from $10,000 a kilogram to $300 a kilogram, then all of a sudden things that didn't add up do add up. And there's going to be a lot of this stuff. Also, these vehicles, a Starship would be able to go anywhere to anywhere on Earth in less than an hour, like Los Angeles to Sydney, for example, in less than an hour. And I believe this will open up a new form of transportation. For 3,000 years, people have made a lot of money on the ocean, some by actually extracting wealth from the ocean, for example, by fishing, but much more money has been made using the oceans as a low-drag medium, a convenient medium for long-distance transport. Well, similarly, I believe that while people are going to extract money from space, as it were, through remote sensing satellites and orbital research labs and all these sorts of things, much more money is going to be involved in using space as a zero-drag medium to travel from anywhere to anywhere on Earth in less than an hour. Mm-hmm. Now, so there's going to be space lines. And there's going to be something else that there hasn't been up till now, which is the advent of reusable launch vehicles means that there's going to be used launch vehicles, which is a thing that hasn't existed up till now. You cannot buy a used Saturn V or a used Atlas, because if they're used, they're gone. Okay, there's going to be used launch vehicles. Now, new cars are very expensive, but around the world, millions, perhaps billions of people of limited means have been able to buy cars of their own by buying a used car, which might cost 10% or 5% or 3% as much as a new car. Well, there's going to be used launch vehicles for sale. And Musk told me that he felt he could, thought that he could build the Starship, which is the upper stage, the part of this that actually flies to Mars, for around $10 million each, which means either he or a copycat, and for instance, there's about 5 companies in China right now that are working on knockoffs of the Falcons. If Starship is successful, there's going to be 5 Chinese companies working on knockoffs of the Starship, as well as free world competitors as well. And either him or one of these competitors If they can build them for 10 million, they'd be willing to sell them for 20 million. And that means at a certain point, there's going to be used ones available for 2 million. And a Starship could take 100 people to Mars. $2 million divided by 100 people is $20,000 a person. Now, I have to admit, I have never paid $20,000 for an airplane ticket. Although there are people that do. That is the cost of a first-class ticket from Los Angeles to Sydney. But certainly for people who are looking to make a life-changing move to cash in their chips on Earth and move to Mars, $20,000 is actually a modest cost. In comparative terms, it's about a tenth the cost as it was to move from England to America during the colonial period. That is relative to incomes. And so this is something that people could do. So there's going to be groups of people who are going to decide for one reason or another that they want to go to Mars, that they want to set up a city on Mars, a city. See, there's always going to be people that are going to want to have their own ideal society. And the ideas of that society will differ a great deal that people have. I think there'll be a plethora of Mars colonies established by people who have their own reasons for doing it. And some of these ideas will be unworkable and those colonies will fail. But some of them will not only be workable, they will be superior. They will offer people a better way of life than they could have on Earth, and they will attract immigrants. And those cities will grow.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in the comparisons that you make between frontier life in the US and frontier life on Mars. And you talk about, you say that people suggest that Mars is not habitable, but the Earth is not habitable either, was not habitable either until it was terraformed. You talk about, so I'm just going to quote here, it's a very similar image that you use to the image that David Deutsch uses in the beginning of his book, The Beginning of Infinity. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yes, I am. I like that book a great deal. I think it's a remarkable book.
Me too. You say that there are no natural resources on Mars or anywhere else in the universe today, but there will be plenty of resources on the red planet once resourceful people arrive. I think that's an extraordinary image. Could you talk a little bit more about what you understand by that?
All right. Yeah, I will. First, though, I do want to correct something you said.
Oh, sorry.
The Earth was not habitable for people until they developed technology. That is, human beings are not native to the Earth. We're native to Kenya. That is, we're native to the tropical Kenyan Rift Valley. That's why we have these long, thin arms with no fur on them. Look, no fur. Okay? But we became able to leave our natural habitat in the Kenyan Rift Valley and colonize diverse habitats all over the Earth, like Ice Age Europe and Asia, and then eventually in the Americas and Australia, by developing a variety of technologies like clothing and fire, for example, language, which was necessary in order to accelerate technological progress, weapons that could kill at a distance necessary to hunt big game, thus making food available in winter in Ice Age Europe or Asia, etc. That is a Neolithic culture, such as, for instance, people witnessed among the American Indians, it's far more advanced than human beings in the state of nature in the Kenyan Rift Valley. And this is the technological innovation that allowed us to become a global species, and now not only global in extent, but linked together globally through first long-distance sailing ships and then telegraphs and aeroplanes and the internet and all of this, so that we actually have become a truly global species that can operate on a global scale. But to come to the point that you brought up, I believe there is no such thing as a natural resource. There's only natural raw materials. It is human creativity that transforms materials into resources. For example, uranium was not a resource until we invented nuclear power. Oil wasn't a resource until we invented oil drilling and refining and things that could run on the product. If you could go to a meeting of the Napoleon Bonaparte and his generals, and they were contemplating conquering some country and they were listing its natural resources, they wouldn't have listed oil, let alone uranium or aluminum, which wasn't even known to science until the 1820s. They would have listed land for sure, but land was not a resource until people invented agriculture. Until then, it was just something you had to travel over to get where you wanted to go. Land in itself is not a resource until you know how to make it produce something for you. Take another example. After the Neolithic period, we got to the Bronze Age, and this lasted 4,000 years. From 5,500 BC to about 1,500 BC, people are using the following metals: copper, tin, zinc, lead, gold, silver. These are metals. They all melt at low temperatures, and they all collectively are 100 parts per million in the Earth's crust. Iron, on the other hand, is like 50,000 parts per million in the Earth's crust. But iron wasn't a resource until people invented kilns hot enough to melt iron. So for 4,000 years, people are using metals, but only extremely rare metals, which is why during that period, metals, bronze, brass, as well as gold, are things only for aristocrats. Once you have iron becomes a metal, which is hundreds, almost 1,000 times more common than copper and gold, then iron becomes something that metals for general use. And it affects not just weaponry, but things like iron tip plows, iron axes, knives. All of a sudden, metals become something for the common people. And now you have a tremendous expansion of civilization because the metallic resources have been expanded several hundred times. And then in the 19th century, aluminum becomes available because we have electricity, which you need. You can't get aluminum out of aluminum oxide just by heating it. You need to have electricity. So aluminum does not exist as a resource until people invent electricity. And uranium does not exist as a resource for any practical purpose until we invent nuclear power. And deuterium, heavy water, is not a resource now of any significance, but it will become a gigantic resource once we develop fusion power. So resources are created by people. And now this is a very important point, because if you believe that resources are something that exist and people are just using them, then the more people there are, the less resources there are for you. And what that means is that human beings are fundamentally enemies of each other. They're competing for finite resources. And you get the view of humanity, of Malthusians, of Nazis, Hitler. Human beings are diverse nations in a battle for survival over limited resources. But this is not true. This is simply not true. The human race does not, is not competing for limited resources because people from all nations or almost all nations are making inventions. Inventions made anywhere ultimately become used everywhere. And so the actual truth is that we are a family, a rather disorderly family to be sure, of nations engaged in a joint product to expand the resources available to all of us through technological innovation. And, people in China or somewhere may say, oh, the Americans, they're using up the world's resources because they use up so much stuff. Well, not so. America is 4% of the world's population, but it's been responsible for the past century or more for 50% of the world's invention, and the other 50%, almost all of it, has been the rest of the advanced nations. And it's precisely because of those innovations that China has been able to enormously increase its standard of living over the past 30 years through everything ranging from electricity to iPhones to, and all these things basically created in the West. But where did the West get its renaissance in the first place? From inventions like paper and printing that were invented in China. So that is the truth. So the question is, okay, are humans creators or destroyers? I believe they are creators. And we have a common interest in working together to invent, to expand the resources available to all of us.
Can you talk us through how a Mars city might come to be developed? Give us a kind of vision from the first explorers arriving and creating a small base to a city of a few hundred thousand, let's say.
Right. Okay.
And talk a little bit about the kind of terraforming and the kind of visions for cities that you describe in the book, which I found absolutely fascinating.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so first of all, I want to contrast it with a vision that is out there that I do not believe is correct. And this is the one that Elon Musk has set forth, where he's going to build a fleet of starships, and he's going to fly 1,000 of them to Mars in 1 year with 100 people each. So there's 100,000 people landed on Mars. And then the next year, they'll land another 100,000, and the next, and then they'll have 1 million people on Mars inside of a decade after the first landing. Basically sort of the D-Day Normandy beach approach. I do not think this is practical. I don't believe that's how this will happen at all. It's not possible because to feed 100,000 people, you have to have extensive infrastructure on Mars, growing food, etc. Now, you can't feed. While you could feed the troops on Normandy Beach by taking Liberty ships across the channel, it only would take less than a day to take a steamer across the channel, and they could carry 10,000 tons of cargo each. A Starship takes 6 months to get to Mars. It carries 100 tons. So this is not possible. So the way Mars cities are going to grow, they're going to grow organically, okay? That is, first you might take one Starship to Mars, and you land 100 people. And yes, and the Starship can bring enough food for 100 people to last a long time. And then they build greenhouses where they're growing food. And now you have some kind of agricultural base on Mars. And now you can bring in a couple of hundred more people. And now they can expand the greenhouses. But not now, the initial greenhouses are probably built with glass and other components brought from Earth. But what you want to do is create on Mars the capabilities to make glass or perhaps transparent plastics so that you can build the greenhouses on Mars. And even not just the glass or the plastic, the transparent part, but the pipes, the plumbing, make all that on Mars. So you need to have the capability of making plastics or metals on Mars to make plumbing, and even perhaps the motors for pumping the water around. Okay, now, eventually, so as you're doing this, you're able to build more and more greenhouses with less mass needing to be transported from Earth, okay, for each greenhouse. Maybe at a certain point, you're only taking the computer chips that are running the greenhouse, but they don't weigh anything to speak of. So you need to build this agricultural and industrial base on Mars. And as you do this, you're creating the capacity to house more people, to feed more people, and the more people you have there, the more people you have creating more capacities, okay, and so forth. So that's how this thing will grow, and it'll grow organically from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands. Now, that's another thing. I do not believe that early Mars cities will be metropolises of 1 million people. Historically on Earth, there were only a very few cities of 1 million people until the 19th century. Ancient Rome had 1 million people, but that's because it was the center of an empire that had this tremendous logistics organization bringing grain from Egypt and North Africa and everywhere, and aqueducts and this whole thing. In order to support 1 million people, you have to be able to transport lots of materials from far away to the place where the people are. And until Mars has railroads and other forms of convenient long-distance transport of not just people, but materials, you're not going to have cities of 1 million people. You'll have cities of tens of thousands. And so that's why my vision of future Martian cities is perhaps cities on the order of 50,000, which is the size of Renaissance of Florence, for example. So you, but that also shows, or Rembrandt's Amsterdam, okay, that you can have very creative cultures within cities on that scale, okay. Hard to do it in a city of 200 people. No, okay, that's too small. But tens of thousands, you could certainly have very creative cultures. There's some technologies needed that would help that a lot. Artificial intelligence to create more skills within a somewhat limited population, etc. But yes, so that's how this will grow. Now, initially, Martian settlements can be funded by the organizations that are sponsoring them, which could be nations, could be religious sects, groups, could be nonprofit organizations of people that believe in a certain cause and a certain political ideology or something, that this is the ideal way to work, whatever. But once it gets started, okay, while the home front organization can continue to be of help, it increasingly has to earn its own way. Okay, so to take some comparisons, if you look at three of the most remarkable settlement initiatives that occurred in the past 400 years, and remarkable because they didn't have a commercial motivation. If something has a commercial motivation, it'll just happen. You can't stop it from happening, okay? But things that don't have commercial motivation must have some kind of other. So if you look at the Pilgrims coming to Massachusetts, the Mormons going to Utah, or the Jews going to Palestine, okay, in the 1600s, the 1800s, and the 20th century, what you had was strong home front organizations sponsoring this thing, and the organizations themselves being motivated by transcendent purposes, that is, non-commercial purposes. They want to do it. But once these settlements get started and grow, in order to thrive, they must have some way of earning their own way. Okay. So they're not started to make money, but once they are there, they need to make money. Because even when Mars, is making all its own iron and all its own glass and making steel and pipes and all this, it's still going to need to import some stuff from Earth. It's going to need to have cash income. Okay. So what are the sources of cash income for a Mars colony? There's a variety of tertiary sources that people talk about, like tourism and sponsoring scientists, and sure, okay, but that's you can't base an economy on that. Okay, one thing though that Mars will be extremely strong in is innovation itself. A Mars settlement will be a group of technologically adept people in a frontier environment where they're forced to innovate. To meet the challenges of that environment. They're going to be forced to innovate in numerous areas, including energy, including automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology, to name just a few. That is biotechnology because they're going to have extremely limited acreage, and they're going to have extremely productive crops, so they're not going to be held back from doing genetic engineering or other forms of biotechnology. They're going to cut loose. Nuclear power. Nuclear power has stagnated on Earth because we have immense quantities of fossil fuels. There are no fossil fuels on Mars. I mean, you can make them if you have another source of energy, but that's besides the point. You have to have the other source of energy. Solar power is weak. Wind is weak. Hydroelectric is non-existent. Nuclear is the way to go. But now we have some nuclear on Earth, but we've allowed it to stagnate. The reactors that we have, I'm a fan of the current nuclear technology, but they're based on the very same design that Rickover introduced for nuclear submarines in the 1950s. And while they work, absolutely, they only get about 1% of the energy out of the uranium that is mined. On Mars, you're not going to want to do that. On Mars, you want to get 90% or something comparable. So you're going to want breeder reactors. We haven't developed breeder reactors on Earth because two things. One is, even at 1% of the energy, the nuclear fuel is only 5% the cost of nuclear power. And secondly is the last thing people who are in the utility industry want to do with nuclear power is try something new, because it's hard enough to get a pressurized water reactor, a Rickover reactor that's been around for 70 years licensed, let alone try to get the regulators to approve something they're not familiar with. So the hyper-regulation of nuclear power has been prohibitive to innovation, whereas the Martians are going to want innovation. And they're going to want fusion power, okay? Yes, there's some fusion research going on Earth today, but look, the international program ITER, it was begun in the 1980s. They still haven't completed it. They're really taking their time. The Martians are going to want to really make this happen because, once again, no fossil fuels, and because deuterium, which is the fuel for fusion power, is 5 times as common on Mars as it is on Earth. Now, an analogy here is steam power. The British invented the steam engine. Americans invented the steamboat. And it's very interesting because the very first steamboat was demonstrated to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. It was called the Perseverance, just like the rover on Mars today. And the first commercially successful steamboat, which occurred in the early 1800s, the Claremont, was financed by Robert Livingston, who was the very same person who negotiated the Louisiana Purchase for Thomas Jefferson. And Livingston owned large amounts of land in the West, and he wanted it to be developed. And, okay, what's the point here? Well, in early America, the only real good highways were the rivers, and sailboats have a hard time on rivers. Steam was the way to go. The British, they were using steam engines to pump water out of coal mines. But if you're using a steam engine for that purpose, it can weigh any amount, doesn't matter. And it can be extremely inefficient, it doesn't matter, because you have an infinite supply of fuel right there at the coal mine. Okay, you want to do steamboats, the engine has to be, relatively speaking, more compact. Okay, it needs to be more efficient. The amount of fuel you're carrying matters. Okay, and so they were driven to develop compact, high-pressure steam engines, which are enabling for steamboats. And then with a certain amount of little extra improvement, railroads, which becomes the transformative invention of the 19th century. So the needs of the frontier caused people to look at making steam engines, taking steam, which already existed, but now making it much more efficient so it could do boats and then railroads, to open up the frontier. And this transforms the world, not just the frontier. And so I believe that for the same reason that Americans invented the steamboat, Martians are going to lead the way on fusion power. And then, as I mentioned, biotechnology and artificial intelligence, because if you've got cities of 10,000, 50,000 people, you don't have the same kind of division of labor you have here on Earth. You need to have technologies that will allow almost anyone to do almost anything, so you can have the same array of skills in a population of 50,000 as you currently have on Earth with 8 billion. And it should be clear that in making all these innovations, the Martians, they need it for themselves. They'll be able to license these innovations on Earth for profit, and they will tremendously benefit life on Earth by creating these innovations. Just as, and to come back to this, by the way, there's a very interesting book called Voyagers to the West by a historian named Bernard Bailyn. And what he did was he looked at the British records of who was coming to America during the late colonial period, the 1750s, 60s, and early 1770s, because the British actually kept records of this during this period. And it's interesting who was the dominant group among the immigrants. It was not the urban poor. No, it wasn't the slum population. They didn't go. It was not the rich. No, they had a reason to go. Although there were a significant number of farmers, they're underrepresented compared to another group which is way overrepresented. And this is craftsmen. People like blacksmiths and carpenters and stonemasons are way overrepresented in the population coming to late colonial America. And, well, that's because people are building cities in America. There's a lot more construction going on. There's all this. But also, the thing is, what this gives rise to. So, relatively speaking, a technologically adept population compared to the average. And you get this culture of gadgeteering in America. And these people are literate, and they set up magazines like Popular Mechanics for themselves, in which they exchange ideas on how to build stuff. And they are especially interested in labor-saving gadgets, because there's a tremendous labor shortage in America. And this is the kind of culture you get, and the so-called Yankee ingenuity. And the Martians, by comparison, will be far more technologically adept than the average person on Earth. And so I think you'll have a tremendous culture of invention. Other sources of income for Mars will be supporting the mining of the asteroids. People talk about precious metals in the asteroid belt. They are there. But those mining operations will have to be supported, and it's about 100 times easier to transport things to the asteroid belt from Mars than from Earth. And so what San Francisco was to the 49ers, the gold rush miners here in America, Mars will be to the asteroid belt. The way to get rich during a gold rush is not to mine gold, it's to sell shovels and blue jeans to gold miners. And that's how San Francisco got rich. That's how Mars is going to get rich. And then finally, real estate development. Because once you actually have cities on Mars, and they're able now to take land and turn it into habitable land by putting domes over it and supplying it with power and other utilities, that becomes something they can sell.
Could you describe to me your favorite model for a city on Mars? Since this is one of my favorite parts of the book, was the Martian, projected Martian cities.
I suspect I know why. Cities on Earth. There's two kinds of cities. I call them car cities and foot cities. And they basically differ in that the foot cities grew into substantially their full forms before there were automobiles, and the car cities after there were automobiles. So, for instance, if you take these compact European cities like you have in Italy, for example, and these were all clearly foot cities. In America, we have a few foot cities like Boston, Manhattan, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Seattle are foot cities. That is, in foot cities, people walk around and they travel from store to store and they meet each other on the sidewalk or in public squares in the street. In car cities, people, like Los Angeles, people drive around from strip mall to strip mall, okay? And I mean, a famous wit from the New Yorker magazine, Dorothy Parker, who traveled to Los Angeles and she looked at it, she said, "There's no there." Where's the city? There's no city. It's just a gigantic suburb that goes on forever. So Martian cities will be foot cities, absolutely, for a number of reasons. First of all, they're going to be compact. European foot cities were compact because many of them were walled cities. They had to fit inside of walls to be protected from attackers. Mars cities will be inside of domes or other pressurized structures to protect themselves from the hostile outside environment. Now, there are planned cities and unplanned cities. I happen to be a fan of unplanned cities. I find them much more interesting than planned cities. So, yes, I have been to Italy and, places like Bergamo and so forth, or, certain parts of Rome, Naples, and where you have this wild, extremely interesting chaos of, that's my favorite city. And, but, okay, there will be people that will go there and they say, here's our plan. There is the radial pattern of the streets and it's all this and all that. And in the end, how can I put it? The results will decide. I mean, Martian cities will be in de facto competition for immigrants. And what will make Martian cities attractive will be their institutions, their prosperity, and yes, their architecture. The Martian cities that are successful, that is the ones that outgrow the rest, will need to be beautiful and interesting. And, it could be that the planned city will be beautiful. It could be that the completely unplanned city of mixed residential and business and factories and everything going on, all helter-skelter mixed with each other, will be the most interesting. It could be something else. I mentioned in the book, I was visited a couple of years ago by this Chinese visionary, and he had this design for a Mars city. And it was a single skyscraper that was like, 300 stories tall. And
it doesn't sound good.
And yes, and there's engineering reasons why this is actually an interesting idea from a strictly engineering point of view. But I just don't see it as a place that people want to live in it. And so I think it would be a failure. I think it'd be stillborn. Now, this, by the way, this issue of competing for immigrants is one reason why I believe the prevailing form of Martian civilization will be free societies. That is, in science fiction, there's a trope of the anti-utopia in space, the totally controlled space colony. And aside from the fact that it makes for a good movie because you can have a revolution against the tyranny and you're off to the races as far as the plot is concerned, but the more theoretical argument as to why an extraterrestrial colony might be a tyranny is because the government could control the air. And so if you break the law or they don't like you, they could turn off your air or something like that. So there's no place to go, okay? Well, that's true in principle, but an extraterrestrial tyranny would not attract any immigrants. So it would be stillborn. So while there could be extraterrestrial tyrannies, they will be outgrown by free societies. America. The predominant problem we had here from a social economic point of view of early America was the labor shortage. This was resolved in two different ways. In the North, it was resolved through gadgeteering, which therefore that society can afford high pay because productivity per person is pay available per person. It's going to want an educated population so that it can continue to innovate this way and have people who can be trusted to manage machinery and so forth as part of the productive process. In the South, it was the other way around. They attempted to deal with the labor shortage through slavery. Okay. So we actually had two social experiments in America, if you will, and they were very different. And how was this settled? Well, it came to blows, but if you ask any American Civil War buff, why did the North win the Civil War? They would say, well, the North had more population and more industry, and that's true. But why did the North have more population and more industry? Because all the immigrants went to the North. The Union Army, the Northern Army, was 40% immigrants and first-generation Americans. Confederates, 3%. And so the more progressive, and I use the term progressive here not in its current political vocabulary, but in the ordinary English usage of the word, society attracted the most immigrants. It's also why the United States attracted a lot more immigrants than Haiti or other tropical slave plantation islands. The more progressive society attracts the talent. And so it outgrows the reactionary societies. So I believe that Martian cities will be free cultures, although they will need to have a high degree of social solidarity because of the nature of the environment. And that is somewhat in tension with individual liberty. But that will have to be resolved. The way the Martian city founding fathers and mothers who can resolve that dichotomy the most successfully, they will create the most successful cities.
You talked about science fiction, inaccurate depictions of Mars in sci-fi, and there are actually two works of sci-fi that I wanted to ask you about, how accurate or inaccurate they are in your opinion, whether any, if you're familiar with these works, whether there are any glaring inaccuracies that struck you, or by contrast, any things that you thought were particularly astute. And the first one is the old classic Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars.
I'm certainly familiar with that.
Personal favorite. How accurate or realistic were Stanley Robinson's visions of Mars settlement?
Well, the most interesting thing. Okay, first of all, the interesting book there is Red Mars, the first. Okay, and that book is profound in its way. Although because what he has there is this debate over whether we should terraform Mars. Okay, and there's two factions. There's the Reds who want to keep Mars red, and the Greens who, in this case, want to bring Mars to life. Okay, so it's the Greens who want to transform the world of Mars. Now, I think this is a very interesting debate. I do not believe that there would be a substantial red faction on Mars. I believe that it will be so self-evident to Martians that it is worthwhile to take a planet in the current condition of Mars and turn it into a living biosphere that someone would have to be insane to advocate that, no, let's keep Mars a wasteland. But it's interesting because it gets to the heart of a debate which is really happening on Earth now. Okay, and the debate isn't about Mars. And it isn't even really about the Earth. It's about humanity. It's about whether humanity has the right to continue the process of creation. And so, and this idea, okay, has a prior history, a prior philosophical history that goes back into religion. And it's the question of whether human beings are of the same nature as the divine, whether we have the right to continue the process of creation, whether we are children of God or slaves of God. This is a civilizational difference, okay? And the issue here is that, okay? And because, in other words, are we something unique whose rights and dignity must be defended at all costs, the rights to create, or are we something that must be suppressed because we are vermin endangering some pre-existing perfect creation? Okay, and so now I know Robinson, and frankly, he's ambivalent himself on this question. I am not. I am not at all. And I think this idea that humans, well, first of all, are, as it were, children of God, whether you believe in God or not, but whether there is something special about humans, that we have this divine spark, if you will, that should be protected, and its right to exercise its creativity protected. That this is a very important idea. It's one of the fundamental ideas underlying everything that's best in our civilization, and that the attack on it is something extremely dangerous.
One thing that we haven't talked about as yet is we've talked about, I think, or at least you have certainly implied ways in which Mars settlement would be beneficial to people back on Earth because of the kinds of because of the inventiveness, the innovativeness of the Mars settlers, and you've compared them to a kind of inventors' colony and to a frontier society with all the creativity that implies, both technologically and also in terms of politically. But one thing we haven't talked about, and I think it's very important, is the way in which knowledge of if we do find life forms on Mars that have evolved on Mars, the kinds of fundamental questions that could answer for us about the nature of life and also whether we are alone in the universe. Could you talk about that a little bit for us?
Sure. Now, this is one of the fundamental reasons to explore Mars, and I think, frankly, the most thorough way to explore Mars is to settle it. We know the most about Earth compared to all other planets because we have settled it and not just visited it or sent a few probes here. But to get to the core scientific question here, the early Earth and the early Mars were twins. They were both planets, rocky planets with some liquid water on the surface and carbon dioxide dominated atmospheres. Early Earth did not have oxygen in its atmosphere. Oxygen is an artifact of life. Life has transformed the Earth radically. But life did originate on Earth before it had oxygen in its atmosphere, while it still looked like early Mars. Okay. So, as above, so below, as below, so above. If were the processes that led to the origin of life on Earth, if indeed life did originate on Earth as opposed to somewhere else and then come to the Earth, put that aside, is the processes that somehow led to the existence of life on Earth, are they general or are they specific or matters of chance? You know, if you leave a bucket of water outside on a night in which the temperature is below 0 centigrade, in the morning it's going to be ice. And it's not a matter of chance. That transformation will occur. Under those physical conditions, water will turn to ice, period. Okay? So is the generation of life from chemistry that kind of thing, which happens simply because the laws of nature dictate the process by which it is going to happen? Or is it some weird thing that is a matter of chance, that some extremely unusual molecule form that somehow could self-replicate and then that led to evolution and life? Okay. If we don't know right now which of those is the correct view, because all we know is here's one planet, the one we're on, and there's life there. And we don't know whether everybody is like us or whether we're the people that won the lottery and nobody else is like us. Now if we go to Mars and we find that there's life there, that certainly would suggest that life is a general phenomenon in the universe. Now, there's a number of possibilities, though, because Earth doesn't just have life. It has one very specific type of life. That is, all Earth life, whether we're talking bacteria, mushrooms, or people, uses exactly the same biochemistry. It uses the same set of amino acids. It uses the same RNA, DNA method of transferring information from one generation to the next. Okay, now, I'm an American. I speak English. I use the Latin alphabet. You are Italian, okay?
No, actually, my name is a bit deceptive, but it doesn't matter. Let's
say you were Italian.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, okay. So your name, your name Italia. Okay, it's not Italian. All right, fine.
I'm actually Indian. So my origins are Indian Parsi, and the name was originally Ita, and then
really?
got corrupted over time and became Italia. So counterintuitively, it's Indian Parsi name.
Well,
so
that's
my
very
father was
interesting.
Zoroastrian
Okay,
Indian.
So this is an interesting thing here. Okay, well, anyway, Italians use the same alphabet, okay, and so do Poles, okay, and so forth, because we're all, we got it from Latin, either from the Roman Empire or the Latin Church or something. You go a bit further afield, Greece, Russia, they use the Cyrillic alphabet. Both the Latin alphabet and the Cyrillic alphabet are descended from the Greek alphabet. If you go to the Middle East, you get to Israel and Arab countries. They use other phonetic alphabets, which look quite a bit different than Latin or Cyrillic, but they still use the same principle of phonemes to create words. In China, totally different. Okay, so all life on Earth uses the Latin alphabet. Does life on Mars use the Latin alphabet? Do they use the Hebrew alphabet, which is related but at a distance? Parsis, I don't know what alphabet are the Parsis holy books written.
They're written in Avestan, which is like an ancient Persian, and very often transliterated into Gujarati script. It's a bit
Is it a
complicated.
phonetic script or a picture script?
Phonetic.
Okay, so it is at least related in that sense. And of course, the language is Indo-European, so it's also related. But in China, totally different. Yet, you can write books with Chinese characters. It can do the same thing. So is life as it exists throughout the universe, is it all using the Latin alphabet? Or maybe it uses different versions of phonetic alphabets that are not necessarily Latin in origin? Or can it use completely different methods of life must transcribe information, but could it be done with radically different language? Okay, so we go to Mars. If we find that Martian life uses the same alphabet, that would at least support the conjecture that this is a widespread thing. If we find it with a variant, that would say, okay, it has to be, as it were, phonetic, but doesn't necessarily have to use the same amino acids. It could do some other stuff. Or could it be just a totally different kind of thing? So by going to Mars, we'll find out, at least we'll become better informed, and the question of, is life on Earth unique in the universe? And if it's not, is life on Earth what all life is, or is it just one particular example drawn from a much vaster tapestry of possibilities? Okay, someone who was only acquainted with Western Europe and America might think that the Latin alphabet was the alphabet, period, full stop. Okay, someone who's traveled the world would have a much different opinion. So we got to travel the world a little bit if we're going to find out the truth about this.
Yeah. And if life evolved independently on Mars, then that has extraordinary implications for the possible prevalence of life in the universe, makes the Drake equation seem much more plausible as a conjecture.
Sure.
That would be, the most exciting discovery imaginable.
Right. Well, now there's another thing there. Okay. There is definitely the possibility that life on Earth is an immigrant phenomenon. This has been believed by some for a long time, because one mystery about life on Earth is that there are no examples of free living organisms on Earth that are simpler than bacteria, and bacteria are already extremely complex. So it's like here in America, there's no example of European architecture that can be found that predates the Renaissance. So you don't find genuine classical architecture in America or Bronze Age architecture or so forth. So because Western culture in the Americas is an immigrant phenomenon. Okay. Is life on Earth an immigrant phenomenon? And if so, did it come from Mars? You might find that out by finding life on Mars that uses the same biochemistry as Earth life, but also including some more primitive exemplars. And then that would tell you much more about the origin of life than you can learn by studying life on Earth. Just like if you want to study the origin of Western civilization, you can't do it by studying architecture found in North America. You got to go to Europe, where the prior versions of Western civilizations existed. So then you could, but in either way, whether we're finding a separate genesis or a prior genesis, you're finding out a lot more about what life is, as opposed to, once again, it's like language. If you only know English, you think English is language. If you are acquainted with a large variety of languages, especially one substantially different, you'd have a much broader concept of linguistics.
Yeah. Robert, I know I've taken up a lot of your time already, but if you have time, people on Twitter had quite a few questions for you, and I'd like to put a couple of those to you.
Let's take a few of them. Okay.
Yeah, okay. So Stephen Fleming, who is a friend of mine and very heavily involved in space research, and he asks, we've done very nearly zero research on human physiology at 1/3 gravity. How much is enough to do in a low-orbit centrifuge near Earth, for example, before sending humans to live in 1/3 G for months or years?
Well, that's an interesting question. It'd be great, and I am an advocate of flying artificial gravity satellites with animals and even people to learn more about 1/3 gravity health effects. However, I have to say that a human expedition to Mars, the risk of health effects due to 1/3 gravity, we're talking first about exploration missions here, where you're going to go to Mars for a year and a half and come back, would rate pretty low on my list of potential risks to the mission. So, if you're willing to risk flying to Mars, you're going to be willing to risk enduring a year and a half in 1/3 gravity. I did once ask Buzz Aldrin, who of course has experienced Earth gravity, zero gravity, and lunar gravity, how did he perceive lunar gravity? Did it seem more like being on Earth or like being in space? And he said, like Earth. Because there's an up, there's a down, the fluids in the body go to the right places instead of puffing up your head and doing all this stuff so that there's every reason to believe that 1/3 gravity is even more like Earth than lunar gravity, and that any health effects from experiencing 1/3 gravity would be certainly less severe than those from zero gravity. And we've had people in zero gravity for as long as a year and a half. Now, zero gravity does weaken people unless they very strenuously work out. I think it'd be logical to conclude that 1/3 gravity might tend to weaken you a bit because don't have the same stresses you get from walking around in 1 gravity, but not as much as zero gravity where you're just floating all over the place. And now a more interesting question will be, before we have children on, how do we know about the developmental aspects of human development if the mother is living in 1/3 gravity. Well, by the time there are people born on Mars, there will have been people who've been exploring Mars for a long time. They'll probably have labs on Mars where they could see how mammals develop in 1/3 gravity. So we'll have some data to support that question, to support an answer to that question. I suspect it'll be fine because the infant inside of the mother's womb is living in 0 gravity now because it's living in a buoyant environment. Now, the development of children after they're born, I think they would have to be encouraged to engage in active athletic sports and so forth in order to make sure that their muscles and so forth develop well. I think, however, that people born and raised on Mars, while they might be capable of coming to Earth, won't like to. Because I think they'll find the gravity here extremely unpleasant. And they'll wonder why anyone would want to live here.
Yeah. That's a recurrent theme in sci-fi depictions.
Yeah, sure.
Certainly it's a major part of the plot in The Expanse, and also more recently in the Orville, where there's a crew member who's from a planet with much higher gravity, and on board at Earth normal gravity, she loses so much strength that she's not comfortably able to go home. That certainly seems like a kind of ongoing issue to be solved. I don't want to call it a problem because I'm quite optimistic about people's eventual ingenuity in solving problems. I think actually probably many of these have already been answered, but I think one final question perhaps, which is how close do you think we are to landing on Mars and to settling Mars? How do you think this could happen in, say, my lifetime? I'm 55 now.
Okay. Well, okay. If Musk was to resume concentrating on SpaceX, because he's currently being diverted in unproductive directions right now, with Twitter and associated activities. But if he's quite a force of nature, and if he was to resume his focus on SpaceX and have a bit of luck, then I think it's quite reasonable to project that, well, first of all, Starship's going to be operational by the end of this year, or certainly next year. Okay, we have a very unpromising situation with the current U.S. election, but in 2028, regardless of who wins the current election here, we will have a new president in the United States. And by that time, Starships will have been operating for 4 years. And this will be the reality of the world. Okay, and you're going to have a new president, one who could be president for 8 years and wants to make his or her mark. And they look at this, they're going to turn to their advisors and say, look, here's this cat wants to send people to Mars. He's got these ships. If we got together with him, could we get to Mars by the end of my second term? And the answer will be unquestionably yes. And and with, frankly, the existing NASA budget, Musk is not developing, frankly, all the systems needed to do a Mars mission. He's developing the most important one, the transportation system. But there's a whole bunch of surface systems that need to be developed, surface power systems, mobility systems, etc. And especially the power system, which needs to be nuclear, which would be something very difficult for SpaceX to develop because there's controlled materials involved. To have a public-private partnership launch at that point and get people to Mars by 2036, by the end of, Nikki Haley's second term, I think that's an entirely doable thing. So, sure, that will be, could be very well within your lifetime. And so that's the first expeditions going to Mars. I think if we do that, I think within 10 years of that, we can have a permanent Mars base. And who knows, within 20 years after that, the first thing that is recognizable, a community on Mars with children and schools and so forth, beginning to emerge. So, yes, I think by the mid-21st century, we could have our first communities on Mars. Now, if Musk remains diverted, or if SpaceX should fail for other reasons, which could be bad luck if they have a launch that sends the thing crashing into Brownsville, or if he should enrage the authorities too much by attacking the Securities and Exchange Commission or whatever, so that SpaceX does not succeed, it's going to take a bit longer. As I mentioned earlier, there are companies that are tracking SpaceX and are copying their successful technologies, but they're about a decade behind them. So if SpaceX should fail, it will still happen, but it'll take about 10 years later.
Thank you so much, Robert. I have really enjoyed talking to you, and I thank you so much for all your work, which I think is incredibly important.
Okay.
I think it's one of perhaps the most important project currently afoot, and I wish you every success.
All right. Well, thank you. And I just want to mention two things. First of all, I have several books about Mars. The one about Mars missions is called The Case for Mars. The one about settling Mars is called The New World on Mars. And secondly, as Iona mentioned, I lead a society called the Mars Society. We're having our next international convention at the University of Washington in Seattle, August 8th through 11th. And people can find out about it by going to marssociety.org. And in fact, if you want to speak at it, the call for papers is still open until June 30th. You can submit a 300-word abstract on the website. So I hope some of you will be there. I hope some of you will come and present your ideas there.
Thank you so much. I hope so too. And I will make sure we spread that message.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you.